in recent years, there's been this huge push on zone two stuff. And I think, yeah, zone two is obviously a key part of any training plan. But if like five of your rides per week are just zone two and you're only doing 10 or 12 hours a week, I think that's pretty quickly gonna stop moving the needle for most people. So yeah, at a certain point you just need to build a plan where there's like progressive overload, whether and yeah, if you're limited on time, that probably means you're having to do some zone three stuff or something like that that is kind of taken a back seat, I think, in the current climate of zone two being pushed super hard.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Brendan Housler with EVOQ Bike. We have Gavin Mannion on the podcast today from USA Cycling. You probably know the name if you followed cycling over the past decade. Absolute hitter on UHC. Was way back in the day on Trek Livestrong with Taylor Phinney, Alex Dowsett. You don't want to miss this episode because he talks about what really moves the needle in performance. Is it riding at threshold? Is it riding above threshold? Is it the VO2 Max training? Gavin has experience across the gamut for a huge racing career, a coaching career, coaching amateurs. There's something in here for everybody. And I just love how he lays out the big picture of training and racing. So where to zoom in? Can you find patterns? Is it better to ignore patterns in training? There's just a lot of ways that you can use this episode to get faster yourself. Gavin, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. Everybody, good luck with your training and racing. Be sure to check out the blog if you need more tips and all the other videos on YouTube. Talk to you soon. See ya. I appreciate you making the time to come on. I know you've had a busy schedule. You're just over in Europe and everything. And yeah, lots of things going on. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Happy to join and yeah, glad to be on the podcast.
Cool. Let's before we do an intro, for people that might not know Gavin, and I don't know if he'll mention some of these things in his intro because you've been in the US cycling scene in Europe, and I mean, way back in 2010 is when I first started hearing this name of, this Trek Livestrong squad with this guy, Taylor Phinney, Alex Dowsett, Ben King, yourself, crushing, and just young guys. You got your first Pro Conti gig on Dre Pack. And then everybody who knows UHC, I think maybe, and we'll talk about this 2017, 2018, you had some mega results. And then you just recently retired in 2022. I mean, I think anyone who's been following US cycling knows Gavin. There's definitely a lot of newer athletes that listen to this podcast that might have started in 2022. So I wanted to give that quick little intro for everybody. Go back, look on Pro Cycling Stats. It's amazing what you've accomplished. And now being able to take that experience to USA Cycling, I'm sure so many athletes are just soaking up the knowledge that you have. With that, can you give an intro of who is Gavin Mannion? What are you doing with USA Cycling? And also your coaching with Dorada, I believe, if that's still current. So yeah, Gavin, welcome. Give us a quick bio.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the intro there. Yeah, I think you kind of sort of summed up the career side of things pretty well. Yeah, I grew up in Boston started racing when I was like 8 or 9 years old because my dad was doing all the master stuff and yeah, just kind of grew up at bike races. So primarily crits and cross were the big things in New England. So that was kind of my intro to bike racing. And then yeah, rode for Hot Tubes as a junior and was sort of pretty lucky with um, the timing of ending my junior career and Trek Livestrong starting up in 2010. So was very grateful to be able to join that squad and was sort of a late addition there in the winter of 2009, I think, going into my first year U23. And yeah, that was just an amazing opportunity and such a well-run, well-funded program that, yeah, sort of paved the way for my career and everything else that you just mentioned there and all those other teams. And then, yeah, I've been coaching kind of athletes for about 10 years now. Started just doing a little bit of personal coaching on the side when I was racing, and then I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Started working with Dorada as a coach. David Wenger was my coach for the majority of my professional career, sort of starting second or third year U23, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, we worked together for the better part of a decade. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, retired at the end of 2022. And again, similar similar to Trek Livestrong, sort of kicking off at the right time. It was USA Cycling was sort of getting all their road programs back up to full speed again. Things had sort of taken a dip as a lot of industries did during the pandemic and everything. So again, it was yeah another sort of right place, right time, and I was able to reach out to Jim Miller and my old teammate Tanner Putt, who's the head of road, and yeah, it just seemed like a perfect fit, and I was sort of able to jump on board as junior national team coach. And yeah, the first year, 2023, sort of did it as a contractor, and then yeah, was able to come on board full time at the start of last year.
That's awesome. I love that. And is that, I think sometimes those of us not in pro cycling don't understand what would a manager do? Like, are you more aligning the team and, you're at the events with them, or are you actually coaching them one on one? Or what's the difference between like your role and maybe your role as a coach with Dorada?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the role of director even changes vastly from level of cycling team. So like yeah, like any small business or whatever, the lower level or the smaller the team, kind of the more broad the things you do are. And then as you kind of get up to world tour level, it's hyper focused on just race day performance and execution and planning. But yeah, for me as national team coach, it is most of the things that you touched on there. Attending our selection events in the US when they don't conflict with European trips, and yeah, just sort of keeping an eye on the talent here and trying to select the best teams we can for the European racing campaigns. And then yeah, pretty much all of the logistics involved in the trips overseas in terms of like finding staff and hotels and all that sort of thing. Probably eats up the majority of the time. We do have kind of a home base in the Netherlands with an operations manager and everything, and they keep the fleet of vehicles up and running and sort of provide the service course with all the equipment that mechanics will need and things like that. So not like totally starting from scratch on every trip, which would be pretty much impossible. Yeah, and then once we're kind of on the ground, it's a little bit of like training coordination more than it is like actually writing training plans. Most athletes have personal coaches, and our trips are short enough and race heavy enough that like training's pretty secondary. So I try to communicate with their coaches and the riders before the trip to sort of make sure everyone knows like what time is actually available. And yeah, I try to get the group riding together whenever possible, even if it's not like as long as it's not sacrificing performance. I think if we can like we're trying to build teams over there in a very short period of time. So I think the more we can get the riders to do together in the 2 to 3 weeks that we have, the better. And yeah, trying to sell uh, type A juniors that are love to go out and like do everything to the T on that can be a challenge sometimes, but for the most part, kind of pays off. So yeah, a little bit of training coordination, and then yeah, normal director stuff of course details and race strategy and driving the team car. Yeah.
I love that analogy to a small business versus a large business and the focus. That like perfectly nails it for so many people. There have been a lot of athletes that have been on here that talk about the difference in American and European racing. When you made the comment of trying to select the best team to go over there and perform well, What are some of the challenges that you see in you're taking these American racers who are doing crits or maybe shorter road races or not, there's not really as many stage races. What do you try and look for, or how do you suss out like this guy might actually be good in Europe if the racing is as different as athletes on here say it is? Is that a challenge at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, um, yeah, road racing in the US is very different than most of the stuff we do with the juniors, especially in Europe. Like it tends to be Northern European heavy and not, they don't do crazy long climbs in most of the junior races. They're sort of starting to pop up here and there. So, yeah, I feel like in the US, like you can kind of dominate road racing and TTs and stuff with just an engine. Whereas in Europe, like the engine sort of gets you a ticket to the game, but if you don't have the skills and the racecraft and all of that other stuff, like yeah, you're going to be racing for 100th, even if you have the highest threshold in the field. So, yeah, I think for me, like, we still sort of try to, it's a little bit of a balance, I guess. Like, they're young riders, right? So we're trying to develop them. So I'm not always looking for the guy that is going to maybe perform the best over there straight away. Like, yeah, if they have the best skills here, I might take a chance on someone that looks like they have incredible physiology and just doesn't have the experience yet to perform over there. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a balance and sort of just try to select the best athletes and see if we can make them the best bike racers as well.
That's interesting. And when you're commenting of like athletes now wanting to do everything to a T, and there's so much power data, and it's probably, I'm guessing, different than when you and Taylor would go on a trip in 2010. Have things totally changed since you were a junior, or how is the game just different now?
Yeah, I would say they've totally changed since we were juniors. Everything just has shifted like 3 or 4 years earlier from my perspective. Like, yeah, when we were juniors, like all the emphasis was just on learning to race your bike. Like, yeah, there was a little bit of pressure, I guess, but I don't know. As kids, I don't really feel that we felt much pressure racing in Europe. And yeah, we had power meters and stuff like that, but weren't linked to the team training peaks, and there wasn't 10 World Tour scouts at every race. And yeah, these guys, everyone has a manager, and all these World Tour scouts are linking up to these kids' training peaks at 15 and 16 years old sometimes now. And yeah, there's just such a closer eye on data and all of that that I think we sort of started to experience as U23s, but probably even still to a lesser extent than the juniors are dealing with now.
That has to be a lot of pressure. How do you think that would have changed your training at all if you were a junior now, thinking forward? Or maybe even
Uh,
your racing, I guess, on like maybe it's just the result. I don't know. Like it just seems like a lot of pressure when you're 16.
yeah, totally. I think there's positives and negatives to it. Honestly, like I think most of the juniors that I see have really good coaches and knowledgeable coaches, and they train really well. Whereas I feel like, yeah, we or myself especially, like I think we trained as hard, if not potentially harder, but just in a less effective in a less effective way. So I think in a lot of aspects, like almost everyone I see is doing things correctly in training, which is also why like the level of racing is just skyrocketing. Like everyone is having a good plan in training and has a good coach, well, mostly. And yeah, from 15, 16 years old, they have these really measured training cycles and sort of get to train where they're at and progress as quickly as possible without like as much of a risk of overdoing it maybe as we had.
When you talk about correct training, this I realize is like just a massively huge topic in itself. But you had mentioned training cycles. what is something when maybe you see this athlete and you say, hey, let me link up, see what you're doing. What is correct training to you when you open up training peaks? You're like, oh, okay, this guy or girl is like doing some things, and maybe on the flip side, what makes you shake your head thinking, oh no, wait, I could be a huge help to them by just correcting a few things here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends certainly on the athlete. But yeah, some red flags I think are way too much volume at a young age. Like if you're 16 years old and there's a ton of 20-hour weeks on Training Peaks, it's a little bit of a red flag, and just like where are you gonna go from there? And yeah, it's something I've spoken with a few of the World Tour teams that are kind of putting a lot of emphasis into talent scouting. Like they've looked at some riders and they're like, yeah, they're very good, but we don't really know, we don't see how they're going to progress. So we're going to kind of select this guy that is at a similar level but is training 15 hours a week on average. So yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a balance to strike there. And then yeah, I think another one is like if you are super limited on time, I think like a lot of juniors can maybe only do 10 or 12 hours a week, or masters as well. And if I think in recent years there's been this huge push on zone two stuff. And I think, yeah, zone two is obviously a key part of any training plan. But if like five of your rides per week are just zone two and you're only doing 10 or 12 hours a week, I think that's pretty quickly gonna stop moving the needle for most people. So yeah, at a certain point you just need to build a plan where there's like progressive overload, whether and yeah, if you're limited on time, that probably means you're having to do some zone three stuff or something like that that is kind of taken a back seat, I think, in the current climate of zone two being pushed super hard.
I love this. And if people have read Gavin's post on Training Peaks, I can think of at least of a couple where it might have been Gila prep back in the day. I have one picked out that I want to ask you about. But you had some pretty savage workouts where one I remember was you were doing some 30-30s or something. And then it's like, oh, and then I did an hour and a half of zone three into X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, wait, did everybody read that? Because nobody's talking about this stuff these days. Do you kind of reiterate this? Because I feel like I don't want to say non-zone two. You said it's really important, but some of these other zones that I feel just don't get the love anymore are hopefully coming back. Do you see those old workouts that you were doing? You did them for a reason, maybe just because your coach told you, but is that something you give to Dorada athletes and young athletes might be like, hey man, what should I do for this long you had a lot of 4-hour sessions, I think, if I remember correctly, that were just on the gas.
Yeah, I think probably some slight changes to that stuff in recent years.
Okay.
But yeah, I think like if you have the time to train over 15 hours a week, probably then zone two is almost always going to be like the backbone of training. Just like if you're doing a 4 hour ride, most of it has to be in zone two essentially, or easier if you're going to do that consistently. Like you're not going to go out there and ride tempo all day and then try
Mhm.
to do efforts above that. But yeah, I mean, it certainly depends on physiology, and I think I'm I'm not I don't think there's any bad training zones. I think there's time and a place for almost all of them, depending on the athlete. There might be extreme cases where, yeah, the very polarized model works super well, where you totally avoid zone three and four, and definitely in certain times of year, sort of have to balance those things. But I think for the average person, like you need to be spending time in all of those zones if you're road racing. And yeah, if you're racing in all the zones, then you probably need to be training in all of them too, just in the right amounts.
I love it. Clip it. Clip it. That's the quote right there. Speaking of training and kind of the full picture, I think there was another article where you had mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you don't maybe think this, 2017, 2018 seemed like your best results. You were the UHC. You'd probably been pro for 7 or 8 years now. Things were everything out west. I mean, like Cascade, Utah, I want to say Colorado Classic. Can't remember if you won GC or a stage. What do you feel like it was probably the accumulation of all those years. But were there some things that you and your coach are like, man, you are really getting in your groove right now, that you remember thinking, okay, this has definitely helped me reach my peak performance? Does anything jump out when you think back to that period in time?
Yeah, I think I think looking back, like you just did over the 7 years before, is kind of an important piece of the picture, and something to remember that like I think we zoom in too closely a
Mhm.
lot of times, like even trying to figure out patterns of where, oh, like I did this for the 3 weeks before this race, so I'm going to do that the next time I want to be good. And it's like, well, yeah, but the 6 months before that, and even the year or two or three before that, that sort of paved the way, are also playing a huge role. So I think, yeah, that was sort of 2017 through 2020, I think was kind of, yeah, just me sort of reaching my age of maturity and kind of having all the hard work as a U23 and early professional days of, yeah, probably doing a lot more of everything than I needed to, and sort of having it all settle in there. I also had quite a light racing program in 17 and 18, which always worked really well for me. Sort of something that is now more common with GC riders in the World Tour, but back then and even now, it's still difficult on Pro Conti and smaller teams where you're just the rosters are smaller. As soon as a couple guys are sick or whatever, you're sort of thrown into things. Race calendars are less predictable, just waiting on invites and stuff. So yeah, I think got a little bit lucky there with UHC sort of being established and having a good amount of invites that we could sort of plan around. And then yeah, just not having a crazy racing load for me always worked well, as someone that could like train and prepare at altitude for stage races especially was yeah, definitely key to that.
That's really fascinating. I think, again, for those of us who have never been pro, thinking about the scheduling and the team's establishment, how much that affects you and your results as the racer versus being on this, lower level team. It's a little bit more chaotic and kind of that small business mindset again, trying to do everything. That's so, yeah, it's really interesting. We brought up altitude training. Was there a protocol that you followed? I think somewhere you were living at 7,000. Do you like to train high and race low, or do you do intervals low, or was there a method to the madness where you lived?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to Colorado in 2017, I think, if that's correct. And I think that's also another pretty key piece to that. I think I was always, before that I had come and done some prep at in Boulder or something before Gila or before Cascade as a U23 or whatever it may be before the big altitude races of the US. And I always felt, well, initially I felt horrible at altitude the first few times. Like you'd come with a team and I would be by far the worst guy for like a week or two. But I always felt like I responded to it more than others for whatever reason. So I think, yeah, that's another key piece there is moving to altitude. I think definitely sort of like changed a little bit of my physiology on the aerobic side of things, which was always kind of the area I needed to focus on. So yeah, I think for me, like training and living at altitude was kind of a game changer for that. And to prep for even living in Colorado on the Front Range, I would always try to. I spent a lot of time and money those years to go and stay at Airbnbs up in Nederland, or yeah, for Colorado Classic, spent a lot of time in Breck and Vale to do yeah, as much time as I could at 8, 9, even 10,000 feet sometimes, which was kind of key for some of those big TTs.
Okay, that's interesting. I love how you were able to adapt to that. When you mentioned aerobic training needing to be more of the focus for you, and maybe this stems from being in the Northeast, cross, crits, smashing, is that an accurate statement? Like you were much more of an anaerobic guy? Because I think people listening, hearing all this GC you're winning big climbs. That wasn't your natural state. Is that correct? You like just was it? And then what was the focus? Were you doing more threshold training, VO2 max training? Like I now realize this is like a massive question, but yeah, what jumps out for you there?
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely started just, yeah, based on where I was living. Like I was a sprinter for the first 10 years I raced a bike, and that was kind of
Well,
what yeah, what I considered myself as a junior for sure. Like every race I won was a bunch sprint almost. And then yeah, same thing early days U23, like the focus was the classics in Northern Europe and flat, windy races with crazy crosswinds and field sprints was sort of where I was. I was never a 6 foot tall, 2000 watt uh, powerhouse. It was more, I was punchy enough and really good in position to sort of get top fives and stuff on a good day there. And then, yeah, I think second year U23 sort of started to see that, um, I wasn't really that big or powerful and maybe wasn't a pure sprinter and slowly was just getting stronger and stronger aerobically. And then, yeah, there's a lot more opportunities in the US, especially to be a GC guy than there is to win, like, with the exception of crits and stuff, which aren't necessarily gonna get you to the world tour. Like, there's no hard 1 day type classic. So I think, yeah, it was a sort of a combination of realizing maybe I'm not just a sprinter and also seeing the opportunities that were easier to grab and yeah, just putting a lot of focus on GC. Honestly, probably too much looking back. I think I lost a lot of my natural abilities to have a fast finish and got too focused on, being light and climbing as good as I could and all that and sort of trained away my natural abilities to a certain extent. And I think there was probably a better way to do that where I could have sort of balanced a little bit of both and been more well-rounded for later in my career. But yeah, anyway, that's sort of how it went.
Yeah, so how the cookie crumbles, but it sounds that's really interesting. I don't feel like many riders get to see that whole spectrum of climbing, sprinting. Like you're in so many different aspects of the race throughout your career. Getting into kind of the training details, talking about aerobic training, what do you think is, I think I like how you kind of, zone two is important, but it's not everything. There's many different ways to train your threshold, your FTP, obviously a very hot topic that most cyclists who listen to this podcast want to hear your insights on. Hey, I'm a cat 3, my threshold's okay, but I know I need to improve it. While everybody's different and they're going to respond differently to training, what do you think are some ways that they could start chipping away at that? Like okay, you need to increase your threshold. How would Gavin go about starting that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends sort of on time availability. But yeah, I think I would sort of look to maximize time below threshold and then spending some key intervals or key time above threshold and sort of, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of doing like a ton of actual time at threshold. I look at that sort of more as practice or yeah, if you're a climber or a time trial guy doing long, steady climbs, you certainly need to know what that feels like and train there occasionally. But I think it's quite fatiguing for the benefits. So yeah, I think I would sort of start by building up time below threshold and then sprinkling in, VO2 efforts and sort of tackle it from both sides there, pushing the ceiling up while also moving the floor. And yeah, I think you sort of have to look at the athlete and see their sort of their power duration curve and see where they may be limited, and that will probably provide insights as to how you should go about moving forward with that.
Love that. And when you mentioned VO2 max training, do you have specific ways that you think are most effective, whether we're talking shorter, like 30 30s, 40 20s, etc., more constant power, maybe something different, a mixture of all of the above?
Yeah, I think Probably a mixture for most people at certain points. I think the 30-30s and the 30-15s and stuff that have become common in the last couple of years are very beneficial. They're quite demanding, obviously, but yeah, I think there's benefits to all of it. I think more experienced riders probably, that's a little bit of a, yeah, might not always be the case, but I think more experienced riders can do the 40-20, 30-15 type stuff, and see really good benefits from that, especially close to racing. I think the classic model of like whatever 5x5 can also work really well for riders, especially if they have like a really high anaerobic capacity and your 30-15s or 30-30s. They're sort of like doing that all anaerobically. Sometimes the longer, steadier stuff works better. And then also for newer athletes, I think those are you have to pace those correctly, which is kind of another thing that you need to learn in because yeah, like if you're on a 5 minute climb in a race and you attack, you sort of need to know how to do that. And doing 30-15s doesn't really tackle that problem as well. I don't think you don't get that feedback on pacing quite as good.
That's a really good insight that you mentioned feedback on pacing and then on the climb before what it feels like. Do you think as athletes with so many metrics now, it's easy to lose sight of that? And do you see that in some of the juniors where, if you took their power meter away and just go rip this climb, they're like, wait, what? Is that like a true statement and just athletes in
Yeah,
general,
totally.
maybe?
Yeah, I think athletes in general, and it's certainly not limited to juniors, but I think there's so much emphasis on numbers now that yeah, you can certainly lose feeling, which is I still think the most important thing for everything. Like, yeah, it's easy to you can look at your whoop every morning to tell you how well recovered you are. You can look at your power meter to see how well you're going. But yeah, I think especially athletes that have grown up with that stuff all the time, they don't they don't necessarily know how they feel or they're not being pushed enough to be in touch with that. And that's definitely something I've lent into more in personal training is just especially VO2 and stuff that's supposed to be pretty maximal, like prescribing it by RPE rather than very specific power numbers because I think it gets the most out of the athlete and also, um, yeah, solves that problem a little bit where you're just getting them to focus on the effort, more than just being a robot.
Love that. I love that. No robotics, everybody. Get in touch with yourself on the bike. What's let's talk about strength training maybe for a second or more than a couple of seconds, depending on how what you think about it. Yes or no for cyclists, and maybe there's a it depends for this person, not for this person. Yeah, what do you think about
Yeah, I
that?
think probably like every training question, it depends
Yeah.
definitely. I think if you can plan it out and one like riding your bike is probably going to be what moves the needle the most for most people. So, with the exception of older athletes, I wouldn't normally sacrifice training time to do it. Like if you have additional time that you can add, then it's certainly beneficial. And if you can realistically do it 80 to 90% of the year, I think it's beneficial. If you know yeah, whatever, if you're a U23 or junior or something and you're going to be doing a ton of bouncing around in Europe and all this racing and it's just really difficult to find a gym and to keep it going throughout the year, then um yeah, I would probably just back off during race season and focus on mobility and staying healthy and maybe do proper strength training still in the winter, which yeah, we sort of know isn't as beneficial as keeping it going all year long. But I think the worst thing you can do is kind of like go once every other week and lift kind of hard throughout the season because you're not doing it consistently enough to get any of the benefit, and you're just sort of like adding another way to fatigue yourself that is, yeah, you're not adapting to it. So yeah, certainly a fan of it if you can implement it well and it's not taking away training time for, yeah, especially for younger people. If older athletes, then I think it may be one of the more, you might build the training around that, just depending on where they are.
That's such a good point. Are you adapting to it? Are you actually doing something to make yourself faster? Or are you just getting a little bit more tired? That's a massive point. I love that. Think about nutrition. I'm sure there's things that have changed since back in 2010 and maybe through the evolution of your pro career. What jumps out there? What are you seeing? Maybe even with the national team or just your riders or cycling in general that might be beneficial for listeners. Like, hey, this is super high carb has been working for a lot of people, or things that have changed. Just interesting things about nutrition when we talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest single change that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years in cycling, and something that would probably have, that I think it's a big reason the sport is going so fast, so consistently, and that young guys are able to jump right in there. Just thinking back to like 2010, 2012, kind of the Sky era, I think we were sort of all on, it's almost the polar opposite of what it is now. Like we were trying to eat as little carbs as possible to still sort of get the job done. And you're kind of just always fatigued and always sort of really limited on what you could do on the high end aerobically. And it was sort of like all this focus was on, yeah, sort of building efficiency and fat oxidation and all of that stuff. Yeah, and I think the nutritional products just weren't there to maybe allow us to push the limits, or yeah, there's the, I think the research was all saying like you couldn't do more than 50 or 60 grams of carbs per hour. And then yeah, if you tried to go more, you probably got a stomach ache, and no one really committed to doing that for 3 weeks and seeing if they could change their gut a little bit, which turns out was probably what we should have done. But yeah, the trend has definitely been towards super high carb, and I think for the most part, that is a really positive change, especially on really hard long days. I think if anything, especially the young riders kind of jump on this stuff. They just take everything to the extreme sometimes, and probably don't need to be doing 120 grams of carbs an hour on like 2 hour rides. But yeah, I think for the most part, it's good. I think it's not really about high or low carb. It's sort of about matching carb needs to output instead of just always doing the maximum, which I think is where some newer athletes get lost currently. And yeah, you can certainly lose a little bit of the benefit to the easier endurance training if you're always just doing 100 plus grams of carbs an hour. You're just sort of making that process a little bit less efficient.
Find the balance, I guess, would be a good way for athletes to try and follow that. What do you think? Maybe more thinking of your Gerada athletes. What have you learned about coaching over the years that's made you better at coaching? That's made you just a better coach.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think finding like the finding people's weaknesses, or not, maybe not necessarily weaknesses, but finding their kind of limiters to performance, and seeing seeing if you can make some changes there, just sort of like looking at everyone as an individual athlete. So, and like yeah, when coaches are reading studies and all that, you're sort of looking at things on a study-wide basis or a population-wide basis, and then it's easy to be like, well, yeah, this works and this doesn't. But yeah, within those studies, like you have high responders and low responders to almost anything, and sort of, I guess, yeah, being a little bit more individual there, and seeing what may move the needle the most for someone, and then kind of tackling that, and yeah, moving on to the next one from there.
When with your experience in cross and crits, and definitely have mentioned already today that there's more than just power and heart rate training. let's say you've got someone who's an average bike handler, but they're going to be doing a lot of crits and this summer. What are some ways, and maybe how often do you think they should work on the soft skills of cornering? And if you're a cross racer, maybe you got to do some running. Maybe you need to do some hot laps in the woods. Or what's a good way for athletes to try and hone in on that because of all this power focus, as opposed to, you said it, you could have the highest threshold. You might be fighting for 100th place in a European road race.
Yeah, I think especially newer or younger athletes, and yeah, this is definitely something that I think is an issue in the US. Is just race more. Think of racing as training in those first few years, and yeah, worry less about these very precise like build and peak and taper cycles, and more about just like how can you prepare yourself to be fit enough and healthy enough to tolerate the most racing that you can do, because yeah, we all younger riders need to learn how to race in a group, or they need to learn the skills that can only really be learned in a cross race or a criterium or whatever it may be. So yeah, I would certainly emphasize like just getting more group racing experience, and I think very quickly you move past the level of being able to improve just from like doing drills in the neighborhood or whatever that may. Yeah, like you can take someone that can rip a turn in the neighborhood faster than anyone, but then you put them in a group of 150 and they can't do it. And it's not necessarily like mountain biking or whatever, where you're sort of on your own. It's highly technical, but you're not there isn't 20 people around you. And I think in road racing, like the biggest barrier to positioning and skill is just being able to do it in a group. And there's no way to simulate that without being in a race.
I think it's important to highlight that you said for the first few years, everyone. I've talked to athletes in their second or third year, and they are upset that they are not a Cat 1 yet and winning everything locally. And I'm thinking, where does this come from? This is like a new thing.
Yeah.
It takes years, everybody. I mean, Gavin can probably speak to this endlessly. And maybe do you see this in the juniors that you get that they go over sometimes, and maybe just expect the moon? And how do you bring people back to like I'm not saying this negatively, but like back to reality so they can see that there's going to be a progression? Is there like a way that you can communicate that to people?
Yeah, it's difficult for sure. I think they sort of need to come to it themselves. Like I think if you do a few racing trips in Europe and yeah, you're not cracking the top 50, then most people sort of start to realize that maybe they're not where they are. But yeah, we certainly see guys that come over with the power to be in the top five, but the skills are nowhere there. And it's not the worst problem to have. You can learn all of that stuff. As long as, yeah, and I think that's like a really big part of my job is sort of pushing athletes in the right direction to get the most out of themselves. But yeah, I think it's just the age we live in right now. Like it's pretty easy to see on Strava, and everyone sort of knows like what world-class power numbers are. And yeah, you see even on a local scale, like these riders that train, they race a few times a year, maybe in their Cat fours, but they're doing like almost professional level power numbers. And to me, it seems backwards as someone who's been in the sport for a long time. But I think if you're coming from running and your intro is whatever, just watching bike racing on TV and these YouTube videos about training and stuff like that, then yeah, you just focus all of your energy on the physical output and like totally neglect learning how to be a bike racer, which yeah, was sort of yeah, the total opposite 20, 15, 20 years ago.
That's great. It's great to get that perspective. When you think back to some challenges maybe that you had in your career, what's some great advice that you've received that maybe you still carry with you, you try and pass on, because it's endurance sports, they're so difficult on not only getting results, but the challenges we face as the athlete trying to grow through that. Does anything jump out at you as something somebody said to you that just stuck around for a while?
Yeah, I think I don't even know who said it, but I think the biggest or the most important thing that I heard was like as an athlete, you have to know what you want to do. You have to have this path in your mind and you have to lay the course yourself. Like no coach or no director can put that out there and make you believe in it more than something that you've kind of come to on your own. Like, yeah, someone can tell you that you might be good at this type of race or that type of race, but at the end of the day, if your dream is to whatever, do something totally different, then I think you sort of need to follow your pathway and make it your own and kind of use your coaches and the resources around you to help you get there instead of um, doing the opposite, like asking others for what you should do all the time. Yeah, I think that's the biggest one for me.
I think it's a really interesting point because especially for those that are maybe doing more traditional American sports, we don't have as much of like prestige of events, which is true on the amateur level. Like, of course, if you played football, there's, the playoffs and the Super Bowl, but it's like, what's your version of Paris-Roubaix or what's your amateur version of the World Championship? Different things for different riders. It's such a cool aspect of cycling that I love you bringing that to light of, what is important to you. That's going to drive us the most. So, what do you think is overrated in cycling training or racing these days?
Um, I think, yeah, I think the whole maybe it's not necessarily bad, but I think the kind of the marginal gains focus or the focus on the details at the expense of like the fundamentals and the basics. And maybe this is just because I'm with younger athletes a lot now, but it seems like everyone's, focused on the aerosoc or whatever it may be, like measuring their carb intake during the race down to the gram, and then yeah, they're going to bed at 1 in the morning, or yeah, they're missing the fundamentals of training, like they're not training enough or they're not training properly, but they're spending all this time worrying about their wax chain or yeah, all these little things that are certainly performance benefits, but only if they're kind of on top of all that other basic stuff that we used to care about.
I love that. That is amazing. So then on the flip side, besides the fundamentals, what's underrated?
Um, yeah, I don't know. I think it might depend a bit on the athlete. Yeah, I think just like proper training,
Training.
diet, and sleep. Like, I think there's a hyper focus now on high carb intake and measuring what you're going to intake during your day or your race,
Mm.
like with a scale and everything, and then you go and eat 4 Snickers bars afterwards, where like you're putting all this time and energy into this, and like you also just sort of need to be a healthy human first and foremost, and then worry about like doing exactly 90 grams an hour later.
Yeah, this is good. You bring up, don't be robotic with the workouts, don't overthink this nutrition. Is this is this more common or is this like individual instances with younger athletes or maybe in athletes through Gerada? Do you see people just trying to be too specific all the time? And is it just, what's the, besides, hey, don't be robotic, like what are some tactics or maybe people listening, if this is resonating with you, you need to hear what Gavin's saying. It might not be helping you. It could be hurting
Yeah,
performance.
it's certainly more with the athletes that I'm seeing like on national team trips and stuff like that, just
Okay.
because yeah, I don't it's probably happening with people I'm coaching. You're just not living with them, so you don't see the other 20 hours of the day. But I think, yeah, I think um, focusing, like if you're just doing the basic stuff, you're probably going to get to 95% of your potential if you do that well for years. Like if you just do the simple stuff well for a long time and you're consistent, you're going to get close enough to your genetic potential. Whereas like if you're constantly focused on these little things and you're doing, your training volume is varying widely from week to week and there's no consistent progression, then you're probably not going to end up anywhere near your genetic potential. And I think, yeah, I mean, most of the athletes I'm working with are trying to get to the highest level of the sport. So like the world tour. And yeah, I certainly try to like pull back on the finer detail stuff and focus on the fundamentals a little bit more and knowing that like they're going to get to the world tour where then hopefully they've been doing the basics really well for years and years and years and then they have access to yeah the smartest people in the world and these scientists that can then start working in those little 1% gains and all of a sudden those add up pretty quickly but only if they're on top of like a very strong foundation. And I think, yeah, most amateur athletes almost never need to worry about that other stuff.
Mm, I like that. So with your sort of inside knowledge of the sport, you're probably talking to tons of people at USA Cycling, had done all the biggest races. Do you think the road racing, the highest level, it will come back to the US, or have things just changed? I mean, there's so many more fondos and gravel has kind of taken some road people away from trying to find racing. And I'm not really one of the people that says, oh, road is dying. It's definitely changing. And I know there's not many stage races, especially at the pro level, but what is someone at USA Cycling? How do you kind of see the future of racing in the US?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer there.
Hmm.
I'm sort of mostly focused on, yeah, developing the juniors to go to, yeah, World Tour development teams and onward. And I certainly think it's interesting that we don't have much of a domestic race scene at the elite level currently. But we seem to have the best athletes that we've ever had on the world stage, like from the men to the women across, yeah, road and mountain bike. And yeah, the track stuff is looking really promising as well. So yeah, it's certainly interesting that we seem to have our highest level of competition globally with a struggling domestic scene. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what will happen here. Yeah, personally certainly hope that some big road races pop up and I don't ever think road's dead. I think it kind of ebbs and flows with gravel and things like that have certainly taken away participation numbers at lower races, I think. But yeah, I think there's certainly still a market for big UCI races in the US if we could just figure it out financially, probably.
Cool. Hope so. What excites you about the future of coaching, training, racing? Anything that where you've seen the sport change a bunch? Anything when you look in your crystal ball of things you see coming down the road?
Um, yeah, I think we're just getting to a point where we're sort of tracking and measuring things really well. Whether it's with, you know, power testing frequently or lactate is becoming a lot more commonly used. And I think for athletes, like everyone's getting a really high level of coaching. And especially like with more and more AI getting kind of worked in, I think it's going to get even better where it's just easier to track these trends of an athlete and sort of prevent the mistakes that all of us made before, whether it was overtraining or underfueling or yeah, whatever. I think where we're at in training, like everyone, well, most people are getting what they need in training, and I think that's just going to keep getting better and better. So yeah, the work that people are doing on the bike is turning into real speed and real performance and less of a guessing game.
When you talk about power testing, everybody knows the 20-minute test. Is there anything new or what are athletes still kind of tapped into? Does the national team still care what someone can do for 20 minutes? Are they looking at 1 minute power, 5 minute, or maybe something different based on the events you guys are keying up?
Yeah, we certainly, I mean, mostly for me, we select from like races. And yeah, most of them have a TT from somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. So that's kind of our aerobic predictor there. But yeah, definitely looking at a whole power profile for an athlete rather than just a 20-minute test. And then personally like to do like the 3-minute and 12-minute combination to sort of, yeah, get a picture of where someone is anaerobically and on the longer end. And yeah, just sort of see that power duration curve and go from there.
Cool. Awesome. What's the we connected on Instagram, so we'll put your handle there. Are you doing any blogs or things with Gerard, or where can people follow along with you and the national team online?
USA Cycling's Instagram is a good account to follow. Just at USA Cycling. And yeah, do a pretty good job of trying to keep the junior stuff posted up there as they've been killing it recently. Yeah, the last trip we did, I think, yeah, we were never off the podium in the, yeah, 6 races we did. So,
That's awesome.
yeah, certainly a lot of positives there. Yeah, other than that, not really on a blog or anything like that at the moment. So just sort of focused on the junior program and coaching the athletes that I do personally.
Awesome. Gavin, this was fantastic. I know so many people will take so many gems from training, racing, the mindset. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat about this and wish you guys the best of luck with the rest of the season coming up.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Glad I was able to
Everybody,
make it.
everybody hit him up on Instagram. If you need help with coaching, hit him up and we will talk to you soon.